I remember a time playing old Nintendo 64 games when to beat a game sometimes required dealing with some absolutely absurd mechanics that seemed very unfair, at least to me when I was a kid. Whether it be Ridge Racer 64, where the bots are basically on hacks, or perhaps a more annoying example, Donkey Kong 64, where you had to play a hardcore version of Jumpman to actually beat the game. That was literally harder than the actual arcade version. Just things like that where there's these difficulty walls that seem rather absurd in the moment when you stumble across them. And in today's video, that's the topic that I want to get into and want to discuss the idea of, should games have unfair mechanics? Should there be a moment in a game where you get absolutely skill checked? Sometimes in ways that don't even translate to the skill required to beat the rest of the game. And it's not just old games that do this. Monster Hunter World and the Iceborne expansion, for example, also has mechanics that could be seen as just completely ludicrous and unfair, such as Tempered Furious Rajang, where the mechanics of that fight are just completely different to a point where playing the game normally no longer works, and you have to find very creative ways to actually get through that fight, or put thousands of hours in to beat that fight. And personally, I have a bit of a mixed opinion on these types of mechanics, because on the one end, I do like the challenge of a lot of them. It can be quite fun to be skill checked to a point where you have to self-reflect and see what you're doing wrong and figure out how you can improve to actually take on that challenge. But sometimes the challenge doesn't even fit the actual game, or is cranked up so high that it's less of a skill check and more of a grind check. So while in some scenarios I like it, there's other scenarios where it seems like it can be too much. And that's just talking about single player or PvE games. PvP games, unfair mechanics are a completely different ballgame that I'm not getting into in this video. But I do think there are some good qualities to having these unfair skill walls that require you to up your game in order to overcome it. Just as long as they're kept within the confines of the actual game experience. I think a good example of this is actually Monster Hunter. There's a lot of fights as you progress through the story that, depending on your level of skill, you may have a really hard time with, and it may take multiple attempts before you can really figure out the patterns and even get close to beating it. But Monster Hunter also has the scenarios where it's too much. I think as long as the unfair mechanics are kept behind optional quests that do not progress the story in any way, or maybe it's like a post-game challenge or something, I think that's when it's okay. It's just whenever they're a core part of actually beating the main game that it becomes a bit too much. And again, I think Monster Hunter, specifically Iceborne, is a good example of what to do and also what not to do. And part of that comes down to the game just being so big that there's going to be moments where specific playstyles are skill checked, and sometimes it's almost impossible to get past that point. Now, I got lucky in my Iceborne playthrough. I play Gunlance, by the way. I got a guard up jewel that lets me block unblockable attacks. That made fighting the Elder Dragons significantly easier, and I was able to go through each one of the Iceborne Elder Dragons leading up to the, quote, final boss, and beat them in one attempt. But I've looked at the subreddit and seen some people struggle putting countless hours into fighting one particular monster, and they just can't even get past it. So for that game specifically, certain weapons, as long as you have the right decorations for them, some of the fights are just a cakewalk, basically. Whereas for other weapons, especially if you don't have the right decorations, some fights are next to impossible. And that's where Monster Hunter's difficulty is both fantastic and also terrible, because some of it's luck. actually a good bit of its luck. A lot of speedruns, for example, wait for optimal AI, where it regularly makes mistakes to get their best times. But some people have to wait for the optimal AI just to beat some of those fights. Those are like post-game event quests, which is not really a big deal, unless of course you want a late-game gunlance, and all the late-game gunlances require you fighting absolutely absurd fights. But anyway, while I do appreciate the difficulty in a lot of areas, there are some areas where, again, it just feels like too much. And I do hope that the new game, Monster Hunter Wilds, handles difficulty in a way that's a bit more well-rounded. But yes, I can already hear the complaints. I know that some people cannot stand the idea of a game becoming easier. I get that. But there's no reason that everyone has to be okay with your level of difficult. And I think in this case, Monster Hunter could be a bit more balanced as far as its difficulty goes. Now, I actually like how Monster Hunter Rise and Sunbreak managed that, because while I was able to beat post-game monster like Valkana, Amatsu, all that stuff, one monster that I could not beat was Apex Zenogre. That thing was absolutely impossible for me to deal with. But I think that's fine, and I don't mind that being there because it's just an optional fight that doesn't really give you much of anything, and it's just there for the challenge. Whereas for Iceborne, a lot of the powerful late-game weapons are locked behind these incredibly difficult fights, which on the one hand does make a lot of sense, and I'm kind of okay with it. On the other hand, it's very annoying, because having to fight Furious Rajang over and over to get the rare drop on it, to then get the weapon that I actually want. At that point, it starts to take away fun from the game, because now you have to play one of the most difficult fights non-stop until you happen to get lucky and get the parts that you need, assuming you can actually beat it efficiently in the first place. Now, for a veteran of the Monster Hunter series, that's not even a challenge. It's just for anyone outside of that, it goes from being a considerable inconvenience to outright impossible. Now, Monster Hunter is able to get around this in a way by enabling multiplayer, where you can have players much better than you help you fight the monsters that you can't fight by yourself. And that's kind of their workaround for it, and that's honestly not a bad method. But I do think there is a way that it could still be a bit more, I guess, convenient maybe. And I know that just sounds like me complaining the game's too hard. But I don't have a problem with the game being difficult in certain areas, as much as I have a problem with how necessary it is to do some of these difficult options and then do them over and over again, because the game has so much RNG that makes it tedious. So I think if those fights that were incredibly difficult guaranteed the parts you needed to get the thing you were trying to get, then I actually think it's fine, because all you have to do is beat it once. But when you're relying on like a 3% chance to get the thing that you want, that's where it starts to become effectively unfair. Because while I don't have issues with difficulty, I have issues when you combine that difficulty with other things that just seem arbitrary at this point. Because it could take you someone maybe 10, 20, 50 attempts to take out this really tough fight. And that can be quite rewarding. But if the reason you're doing this fight is to get parts, to unlock something that's really cool, and you don't get the parts you needed because you needed the rare drop, I think that's too much. And that is an area where I think Monster Hunter could improve on, where you can keep the difficult post-game fights, but have those guarantee the parts that you need beating it the first time, so that you don't have to constantly fight it and just hope that it works out for you. That's where, for me, the difficulty becomes arbitrary and unreasonable. But that's just my take on it. I am kind of curious about where you specifically draw the line, where a game goes from being difficult to unfair. And again, I'm not talking about PvP games. That's different. I'm specifically talking about PvE games. At what point does the game become too much, where the grind's too big or the fights are too hard, or it's some combination of both. Because where I get upset is when it's a combination of both. And I could talk about Tempered Furious Rajang and how it's sped up to the point that 80% of options, and even just the way they tell you to play Iceborne, doesn't work against Tempered Furious Rajang. Just, like, straight up, you can't even use most of the mechanics anymore because of how sped up that is. That, to me, is really pushing my limit of what I would consider fair. I know, it's supposed to be a hard fight. I get that. But man, did it have to be done that way.